The young man stood at the edge of the long driveway, staring at the house he had built from nothing. Pristine white marble, gleaming columns, manicured lawns that stretched like green silk. Today, he didn't feel like the owner of any of it. He felt like an intruder. His clothes were stained and torn. His face was unshaven. His shoulders hunched under the weight of a single weathered bag. The same house that once celebrated his success was now about to judge him by his appearance. What he didn't know was that this day would expose a betrayal so profound, it would shatter everything he believed about family and loyalty forever. Before this story starts, answer this. Would you rather find out your family is using you now or after they've already taken everything? That's what Herbert discovered. And in the next 18 minutes, you're going to learn exactly how he did it. But first, and this is critical, subscribe to this channel. Why? Because next week, we're releasing the companion video, 7 Signs Your In-Laws Are Plotting Against You. Miss it, and you might miss the warning signs in your own life. Subscribe takes 2 seconds. Regret lasts forever. Now, let's begin Herbert's story. Herbert was a self-made millionaire. He grew up poor in a forgotten neighborhood, watching his mother work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. He promised himself that one day, he'd build something no one could take away. Years of sacrifice, calculated risks, and relentless ambition paid off. Herbert built a real estate empire, luxury developments, commercial properties, holdings that touched 3 states. He married Jennifer, a woman from old money whose family smiled at him, but never quite saw him as their equal. Their son Miguel became his reason for everything. But at every family gathering, Herbert felt the measuring stares of his in-laws, George and Smith. He heard their questions about investments, wills, succession plans. A dark suspicion grew inside him. If everything disappeared tomorrow, would they still claim him as family? That question haunted him. So Herbert made a decision that shocked even himself. He handed his empire to his trusted lawyer Maxwell. He created a false trail of bankruptcy and lawsuits. He withdrew only cash. He left his watch, his phone, his symbols of success behind. He returned home looking like a man who had lost everything. He wanted the truth. When Herbert walked up the driveway, voices drifted from the front steps. His in-laws were visiting George in his expensive navy suit, Smith in elegant burgundy, Jennifer in black, Miguel standing with them. Well-dressed, comfortable, confidence. He stepped closer, his torn clothes drawing every eye. The conversation died. George's expression hardened. Smith's lips pressed into a thin line. Even Jennifer looked uncertain. Herbert climbed the marble steps he had paid for. Then someone spoke his name, not with warmth, but with cold recognition. George pointed at him, his voice cutting through the silence. What the hell happened to you? Herbert was born into nothing. His neighborhood was where dreams came to die. Crumbling buildings, broken streetlights, families that counted every dollar twice. His mother cleaned other people's homes, her hands raw and cracked by the time Herbert was old enough to notice. His father? Gone before Herbert could form memories of him. Just another man who couldn't handle the weight of poverty. Herbert made himself a promise at 12 years old, watching his mother cry over an eviction notice. He would build something permanent, something no one could take away. And he did. Through decades of 18-hour days, strategic gambles that kept him awake at night, and an iron will that refused to break, Herbert built an empire. Luxury condominiums that redefined city skylines. Commercial properties that generated wealth while he slept. Holdings across 3 states, each one a monument to the boy who had nothing. He married Jennifer when he was 35, beautiful, educated, from a family whose wealth stretched back generations. She loved him, or so he believed. Their son Miguel arrived 2 years later, becoming Herbert's anchor in a world that still felt uncertain despite his success. But Jennifer's family was different. Her father George and mother Smith attended every holiday, every celebration. They smiled. They shook his hand. They always asked questions about his investments, his estate planning, his succession strategies. At first, Herbert thought it was genuine interest. But over time, something colder crept into their eyes when they looked at him. A calculation, an assessment of value. Were they family? Or were they simply waiting for their opportunity? That question kept Herbert awake long after everyone else had gone to bed. It happened on a Thursday evening in late September. The dining room was warm with laughter, the table crowded with extended family. Herbert excused himself, stepping onto the back terrace for air. The night was cool, peaceful. Through an open window, voices drifted out low, careful, conspiratorial. George's voice. When the old man finally steps aside, we need to be ready. Herbert froze. Smith responded, quieter but clear. We need to secure Jennifer's future and ours. The properties alone are worth millions. If we position things correctly now, George continued, the transition will be seamless. He built it, but blood is blood. Herbert's chest tightened. His hands gripped the terrace railing. They weren't talking about a distant relative. They were talking about him, planning around him, planning for when he was gone, or perhaps when they could push him aside. He walked back inside slowly. George was laughing at someone's joke. Smith raised her wine glass in a toast. They saw Herbert and smiled warmly. George clapped him on the shoulder. There he is. We were just saying how lucky Jennifer is. Herbert smiled back. But behind his eyes, something had shifted. That night, alone in his office, Herbert made a decision. He would find out the truth. He would strip away everything they valued about him, his wealth, his status, his power, and see what remained. The plan would cost him his dignity. It might cost him his marriage, but it would reveal their souls. Herbert called his lawyer Maxwell at dawn the next morning. They met in a private office downtown, away from prying eyes. I want to disappear, Herbert said. Financially speaking, Maxwell's eyebrows rose, but he didn't question. 20 years of handling Herbert's affairs had taught him when to listen without judgment. Over the next 2 weeks, they constructed an elaborate fiction. Herbert's assets were transferred into a protected trust under Maxwell's control. False documents were created, lawsuits from disgruntled investors, failed property deals, mounting debts. On paper, Herbert's empire was crumbling. In reality, every cent remained secure, hidden behind legal walls his in-laws would never penetrate. But the financial illusion wasn't enough. Herbert stopped shaving. He stopped sleeping, letting exhaustion hollow out his face. He wore the same clothes for days. Jennifer noticed, her concern growing with each passing morning. Herbert, are you okay? You look just stressed, he deflected. Business complications. 7 days before the test, he moved cash into untraceable accounts. Then he packed a single bag of worn clothes, nothing valuable. Standing before the mirror in a torn shirt and stained jeans, Herbert barely recognized himself. His hands trembled as he gripped the bag. He thought of George's voice through that window, of Smith's calculating eyes. Let's see who you really are, he whispered to his reflection. Then he walked out the door, leaving everything behind. Sunday arrived with perfect weather, the kind of afternoon meant for family gatherings and comfortable lies. Herbert stood at the end of his own driveway, watching the scene unfold on his front steps. George stood tall in a crisp navy suit, his silver hair catching the sunlight. Smith beside him wore an elegant burgundy ensemble, her posture regal. Jennifer, his wife, stood slightly apart in black, her expression unreadable. Miguel, their 16-year-old son, leaned against a column in jeans and a casual shirt. For other relatives lingered in the background, drinks in hand, laughter floating on the breeze. Herbert's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it, the moment of truth. He began walking. Each step felt heavy, deliberate. His torn clothes hung loose on his frame. The single bag over his shoulder looked like everything he owned because that's what they needed to believe. The laughter died first, then the conversation. Heads turned, eyes widened. Herbert climbed the marble steps he'd paid for, steps he'd walked 1,000 times as a king returning to his castle. Today, he climbed them as a beggar. George's face contorted, confusion giving way to disgust. What the hell happened to you? Herbert's throat tightened. His voice came out cracked, broken. I lost everything. The lawsuits, the investments, bad deals I couldn't recover from. It's all gone. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. Then Smith laughed at a cold, sharp sound that cut through the air like glass. Gone? Just like that? You expect us to believe you lost everything. Herbert looked at Jennifer. Her face had gone pale, but she said nothing. He looked at Miguel, whose young eyes showed confusion, not yet understanding what was happening. I need help, Herbert said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I need my family. George's face transformed. The polite mask he'd worn for years cracked, revealing something harder underneath. This is absurd. This is some kind of joke. It's not a joke, Herbert said. Smith crossed her arms, her burgundy jacket suddenly looking like armor. Jennifer, take Miguel inside. Now. But Miguel didn't move. He stood frozen, his eyes darting between his father and his grandparents. Jennifer's voice trembled. Herbert, what are you saying? How could this happen? Herbert forced the words out. I'm saying I'm broke. The company's being liquidated. Creditors are circling. Bad investments I thought would pay off. They didn't. Lawsuits I thought I could fight. I lost. I just need somewhere to stay while I figure this out. George stepped forward, his finger jabbing the air toward Herbert. You need to leave. Now. This is our daughter's home, and you're not dragging her down with you. Dad. Jennifer's protest was weak, uncertain. He made his choices, Smith said, her voice ice. Poor choices. Reckless choices. We can't let his failure drag us all down. We won't. Herbert turned to his wife, his voice breaking. Jennifer, please. Her eyes filled with tears. Her mouth opened, but no words came. She looked at her parents, then back at Herbert. Torn. Silent. Then a voice cut through the tension. He's my father. Miguel stepped forward, moving past his mother, past his grandparents. His young face was set with determination. He stays. Made her decision with tears in her eyes. You can stay in the guest house. Not the main house. Just until you figure things out. It was a compromise that satisfied no one. George's jaw clenched. Smith's eyes flashed with anger. But Miguel nodded, relief washing over his face. The guest house sat behind the pool, separate from the main residence, a cottage that had once housed visiting business partners. Now, it housed Herbert, the fallen king of his own empire. Over the next few days, Herbert discovered what it meant to be invisible in his own home. He woke early, watched from windows, listened to conversations drifting across the lawn. And what he heard turned his blood cold. George on his phone, pacing the terrace. We need to move quickly before he manipulates her further. Desperate men do desperate things. Smith meeting with Jennifer in the library, their voices low but audible through the cracked window. Divorce protects you legally, darling. You married him when he had money. You're not obligated to follow him into poverty. Herbert watched them research law firms on Jennifer's laptop. Heard them discuss asset protection, prenuptial clauses, legal separation. Smith even suggested her voice was so casual it made Herbert's stomach turn that Jennifer should consider seeking sole custody of Miguel for stability during this transition. They weren't helping him. They were erasing him. But there was Miguel. Every evening, the boy appeared at the guest house door with food from the main kitchen. He'd sit on the worn couch, asking questions Herbert couldn't fully answer. Dad, what's really going on? Herbert looked at his son's face so young, so earnest, and felt something crack inside his chest. I'm finding out who people really are, he said quietly. Miguel nodded slowly, as if he understood more than he should. On the fifth day, Herbert noticed George and Smith leaving the house together mid-morning, dressed formally. Something in their purposeful stride made him follow. He kept his distance, still playing the part of the broken man. They drove to a law office downtown, prestigious, expensive, the kind that didn't handle simple divorces. Herbert waited across the street, then moved closer when he saw them through a second-floor window. A conference room, a lawyer in a gray suit. Documents spread across a polished table. Herbert's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone and started recording audio through the partially open window. The voices were faint but clear enough. These are Herbert's primary properties, the lawyer said, pointing. And these documents outline Jennifer's potential inheritance rights as the spouse. What about legal separation? Smith asked. That would protect her assets immediately. If filed now, during his financial vulnerability, we could argue she had no knowledge of his mismanagement. George leaned forward. And power of attorney? if he's unstable, depressed. It's possible, the lawyer said carefully, with the right documentation. Smith's voice turned calculating. We need to move these assets into family trusts, ones that exclude him entirely. He came from nothing, George said, and Herbert heard the contempt dripping from every word. He'll return to nothing. Jennifer and Miguel deserve better. Herbert's hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the phone. Rage flooded through him hot, consuming. But beneath it was something colder. Vindication. He had his proof, but it wasn't enough. Jennifer needed to see this herself. She needed to hear it with her own ears, see it with her own eyes. Only then would she understand who her parents really were. Jennifer found him on the 6th day, kneeling in the garden behind the guest house, pulling weeds from soil he'd paid to have landscaped. His hands were dirty, his back bent. He looked up when her shadow fell across him. They want me to divorce you, she said quietly. Herbert went still. They say it's to protect Miguel and me. That if I don't act now, your debts could consume everything. Her voice was flat, exhausted. They've already contacted lawyers. Herbert slowly stood, brushing dirt from his hands. What do you want? Jennifer hesitated. Her eyes were red from crying. I want to understand how this happened. How you lost everything. Her voice broke. My parents say you were always reckless with money. That this was inevitable. That I was too blinded by love to see it. Herbert saw his moment. Come with me, he said. What? Just come. Please. He led her through the side yard, toward the main house. George's car was in the driveway. They were meeting with the lawyer again, right there in the study. Herbert had seen them arrive an hour earlier. He brought Jennifer to the window, hidden behind the tall hedges. The study window was cracked open for air. Inside, George, Smith, and a lawyer sat around the desk. We need to liquidate the properties quickly, George was saying, before Herbert contests anything. Once Jennifer files, we move everything into the family trust. And the boy? Smith asked. Miguel will understand eventually. He's young. He'll adapt. Jennifer's face was drained of all color. Her hand gripped Herbert's arm. They think you're already gone, Herbert whispered. They're planning your future without asking you. Jennifer's breathing quickened. She stared through that window at her parents plotting, scheming, dividing up a life she was still living. They never saw me as family, Herbert said softly. They saw me as a transaction. On the 7th day, Herbert made the call. I need everyone in the living room. Now. Jennifer looked at him with confusion, but something in his voice steady, certain made her nod. She gathered the family. George and Smith arrived from the guest wing, irritation on their faces. Miguel came down from his room. The extended relatives who'd been staying for the week filtered in, curious and uncertain. Herbert stood by the fireplace, calmer than he'd been in days. Almost serene. He pulled his phone from his pocket and placed it on the coffee table, then a folder of documents. Then, and this made George's eyes narrow as watch, the expensive Patek Philippe he'd supposedly sold weeks ago. I want you all to hear something, Herbert said. He pressed play. George's voice filled the room through the phone speaker. He came from nothing. He'll return to nothing. Smith's voice followed. We need to move these assets into family trusts, ones that exclude him entirely. The lawyer's voice. Power of attorney, if he's unstable. George's laugh. Jennifer and Miguel deserve better than dead weight. The color drained from George's face. Smith's mouth opened in shock. Herbert played more. They're plotting. They're scheming. They're cold calculations about his properties, his wife, his son. Every word is a betrayal. George lunged forward. Where did you? How dare you? It was a test, Herbert said quietly, his voice cutting through the chaos. The room went silent. The company isn't gone. The money isn't gone. The bankruptcy, the lawsuits, all fabricated. He looked directly at George and Smith. But your masks are gone now, too. Chaos erupted. Smith screamed about invasion of privacy, about entrapment. George called him paranoid, manipulative, sick. The extended family members whispered frantically to each other. But Herbert only watched Jennifer. She stood frozen, staring at her parents with an expression he'd never seen before. Horror, betrayal, devastation. You were planning my divorce, she whispered. You were taking my son. Miguel moved first. He crossed the room and stood beside his father, his young face set with quiet certainty. "I knew something was wrong," the boy said, looking at his grandparents. "The whole thing felt off. But I also knew my father wouldn't lie about needing us." Jennifer's tears came then, hot and fast, streaming down her face as she turned to her parents. "How could you? How could you plan my life, my son's life, without even asking us?" George's face reddened. "We were protecting you from his instability, from his recklessness. By stealing from him." Jennifer's voice rose, cracking with emotion. "By planning my divorce behind my back. By discussing custody of my son, like his property being divided." "We did what was necessary," Smith started. "You did what was greedy," Jennifer cut her off. Herbert stepped forward, his voice quiet but carrying through the room. "I needed to know if I was family or just a bank account." He looked down at Miguel, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "You passed, son. You saw a man who needed help, and you helped him. No calculations, no conditions, just love." Miguel's eyes glistened, but he stood tall. Herbert turned to Jennifer. "I'm sorry I tested you. I'm sorry I put you in this position. But I'm not sorry I found the truth." Jennifer nodded, unable to speak. George made one last attempt. "This is entrapment. This is over," Herbert said firmly. He looked at the extended family members, uncomfortable witnesses to the unraveling. "George and Smith are no longer welcome in this house." "You can't," Smith began. "I can, and I am." Two of the relatives moved toward George and Smith, gently but firmly guiding them toward the door. Their protestations echoed down the hallway, growing fainter until the front door closed with finality. The living room fell silent. The family was fractured. But Herbert realized, looking at Miguel's steadfast face and Jennifer's tear-stained but resolute expression, that the right fault lines had been exposed. Sometimes breaking reveals what should have been separated all along. 3 days later, Herbert, Jennifer, and Miguel sat together on the back terrace, the same place where Herbert had first overheard the conversation that changed everything. The evening was quiet, the air cool. "Trust is earned," Herbert said, staring out at the gardens. "I learned that growing up poor. Every relationship was transactional. Every kindness had a price." He paused. "But I forgot that trust also has to be given. That without it, love withers." Jennifer nodded slowly, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold. "My parents showed me who they really are. That's a gift, even if it hurts. Even if it changes everything." Miguel looked between them, his 16-year-old face trying to process adult complexities. "So what now? What do we do?" Herbert smiled sadly. "Now we rebuild. This time with honest foundations. No tests, no games, just the truth, even when it's hard." Jennifer reached for his hand. "Can we do that? After everything?" "We have to try," Herbert said. The story of Herbert's test spread quietly through their social circles, generating whispers and judgment. Some called him manipulative. Others called him justified. But Herbert had learned something that transcended public opinion. Some betrayals reveal themselves slowly, like rust eating through metal. Others require pressure to crack the surface and expose what was hidden underneath. Herbert's test was manipulative, perhaps even cruel, but it exposed a conspiracy that would have destroyed him, stolen his empire, and poisoned his son's future. The question remained, hanging in the air like smoke. In a world where family can become enemy, how do we protect ourselves without losing our capacity to trust? And when we discover that love has limits, boundaries drawn in ink and greed, what do we do with that knowledge? Herbert didn't have all the answers. But sitting there with Jennifer and Miguel, building something new from the rubble of broken illusions, he knew one thing with certainty. Sometimes the truth costs everything, but lies cost more. So is Herbert a genius or a manipulator? Here's what I want you to do right now. First, smash that like button if this story hit you in the chest. Second, if you're not subscribed, subscribe now, because we release stories like this every single week, and the next one might be the one that saved your relationship, your money, or your sanity. Third, and this is the most important part, comment below. Team Herbert if you think he was justified, or Team Jennifer if you think he went too far. Let's see where this community stands. And if someone you love needs to see this, share it. You might just open their eyes before it's too late. See you in the next story.